If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. The reason I do this podcast is to try to help us think about how we use our attention. And the use of our attention is a big component of how we manage ourselves. I want us to manage ourselves very well for reasons that I've gotten into in other episodes. I think what you need to manage is your attention. What we need to do is manage our attention and get very good at that and have systems for managing our attention. When I see things, systems, advice that I believe waste our attention or lead us down a poor path of self-management practice, I try to call them out for you so you can begin to think whether or not you really need to do this. There's lots of advice out there in the world about how to do better, lots of self-help, self-improvement advice. Much of it is really good, in my opinion. Some of it, not so good. And so to the degree that people make a lot of noise around a concept that I don't think is useful, then I'm going to call it out here. And that is a little bit of controversy. This may, in fact, be one of the lies about work kind of podcasts, but that's not in the title. If you're spending a lot of attention and time on setting and tuning goals for yourself, and if that raises your stress level or leads you down some sort of path of unhappiness, then this is an episode for you, because we're going to talk about goal setting and try to tune up areas where goal setting is useful and areas where goal setting is probably not useful, in my opinion. I'll just launch the conversation by saying I don't think goal setting is the one treatment to rule them all. I think that there are other and better ways for you to motivate and manage yourself than simply by setting goals. So in this episode, we'll talk about some of the nuances of the process of goal setting. And hopefully at the end of our talk, you'll have some more knowledge to understand whether or not this is something that's useful for you. And you'll be able to decide to follow down that path versus just accepting the legendary wisdom of people who seem to believe that that's the only way for you to manage yourself, that goals are the only way for you to run your life. And there is a lot of hype around goals. I know a lot of people that are in the same line of work that I am in who go on and on about goals and SMART goals. And if you're not achieving your results, then you need to set better goals or more goals or whatever that is. I think it tends to be overblown. And I think it's also a lot of overhead, a lot of attention and time that could be better spent elsewhere. And that there are some motivational challenges around goals that we can probably address. So the question is, what's the evidence that the process of goal setting as it's delivered to us in the present discussion, does it help? In other words, are we more likely to achieve if we use goal setting processes? And if we're not achieving, is there a problem with our goal setting processes? So we'll talk a little bit about the science behind goal setting, and I'll get into some discussion of that science, the quality of that science. And we'll talk about some of the challenges of using goals as your self-management process. So all of our thinking around goal setting, and when I talk about goal setting, I'm talking about you have to have a lot of goals. They have to be smart goals. All of this nuanced thinking came about in about the middle of the last century. And it was psychological studies done. Now, one thing that you need to know about that time in psychological science is there was a battle going on between two different schools of thought. And the behaviorist school of thought had been perking along real well for years. And then in the middle of the last century, things started to change a little bit around where the overall philosophy of psychology was. Now, I'm an amateur in psychology. And so if you'd like to argue with me, I'll certainly listen to your comments and would love to have a discussion around this. But the way I see behaviorism is that it's very mechanical. It's very, if I say Newtonian, what I mean is the notion that the universe is predictable. So a Newtonian thought, for example, is if I can measure the properties of every particle in the universe now, then using the laws of physics, I could tell you the state of the universe at some point in the future. And some people, the strong version of this is at every point in the future. Behaviorism really took that mindset and applied it to psychology. So behaviorists thought very much in terms of stimulus response. And they did lots of experiments on animals, which is fine. But they then took that as evidence that human beings behave the same way. And their view was, well, I'll critique the science a little bit more in a minute, but what we need to think about is that this science behind goal setting resulted in an acronym that you've heard, which is SMART goals. And there was science done in the middle of the last century, and it has since been replicated, that making your goals specific, that's the S, measurable, that's the A, actionable, reasonable, and time bound helped people achieve better. And this has turned into a cottage industry in the self-improvement business. And you've heard probably a lot of people talk about, well, set goals and make sure they're smart goals. And smart goals are more effective somehow than goals that aren't smart, whatever that means. And you can manage your life and yourself through this process. Now, because of the background of the science, some of the discussion is around motivation. And it's usually not directly called out in goal setting, but it's an underlying thought that if you set goals, you're somehow better motivated in order to achieve those goals. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Well, so thinking about the science as science, and I started to talk a minute ago about behaviorist thinking. And I got as far as behaviorist really viewed stimulus and response as deterministic factors. Now, I said they experiment on animals, and it's true. And I don't have any moral problem with experimenting on animals. I don't like animal cruelty any more than anybody else, but that's a fine line. But when we start thinking about that overall mindset of the science that was done here, it's very much a brain as machine mindset, and very much if you give what you had to do is tune up the stimuli in order to get the behavior that you wanted to get. I'm reasonably confident that most psychology has moved away from that behaviorist paradigm, at least when it has to do with humans. And that's why I brought up the animal research. I think animals are much more attuned to stimulus and response than human beings are. And I think this is my philosophy, and you'll see my Christian philosophy come through here. I think that humans have the ability and really need to exercise the freedom of not automatically responding to a stimulus. And this goes back to Stephen Covey. And Covey talked about building in some responsibility, and he hyphenated the word response dash ability. And he did that to highlight that we as humans really have the ability to choose our response to any stimulus. And his evidence for this was Viktor Frankl. And if you've listened to other episodes, you've heard me talk about Viktor Frankl. He was a Jewish psychiatrist who was in Nazi prison camps for 4 years, and he survived, and he wrote a book and really a model of psychology around how one separates the response from the stimulus. And so he was all about that piece of thinking. So we as humans can do this in ways that animals can't. And I think it's very important that we do it. That said, I think that that's evidence, and there are other pieces of evidence as well, that humans have something beyond the stimulus response. That we're not brain as machine, that we're not just a bundle of instinct, and we say we act instinctively, but as Covey said, we need to build in some opportunity to question that instinctive reaction to stimuli. And I think this is a very important thing. But the point of all this is, I don't think that the brain as machine philosophy really describes humans very well. And it's a nuanced thing, but I think that's part. So just describing to you kind of the scientific mindset around this research on goal setting. So what psychiatrists did is they said, okay, well, we want to see the result of goal setting on performance of a task. And as with any lab experiment, they had to do certain things in order for the experimental process to produce results. And one of the treatments that they tried is to say, okay, well, let's have somebody with a vague goal in mind. And then let's have somebody with a specific goal in mind, and let's measure the performance of the two groups. And as is well reported and pretty much reasonable conclusion, they found that the people that set specific goals performed better and got better results than the people who didn't set specific goals. And they went on and studied some other aspects of goal setting, which is where we get the SMART acronym: specific, measurable, actionable, reasonable, and time-bound. And when we look at that, and different people use different words in the acronym, and the acronym has even been expanded that I'm aware of to smarter goals. So there's another E word and another R word that they throw in. And the science is very clear that these things do tend to improve performance to some degree. Now, this is one of those cases where in science, you can have a statistically valid result with a small, what's called effect size. So the science shows that making a goal more specific does in fact improve outcomes, however that was measured, but by a small margin. And that's fine. So what they did is they said, okay, well then these things, they didn't study them in combination. So they didn't study all the smart ideas in one experiment. They studied them individually, which makes for good science. But again, the effect sizes were very small. And so I think that in the self-improvement business, in the self-management business, I think that the noise on SMART goals is overblown. I think it has some challenges, and we'll think about those challenges. We've talked a little bit about the science, and don't hear me say that I'm arguing with the science. I'm simply debating the application of the science back into our own self-management and our own performance management. Now, I am very much a contrarian on this point. I don't know of anybody else who really has taken up the argument against this goal setting paradigm that you're probably familiar with. Thus, it's controversial, and I'd love to have a conversation about it. Right here, I'll give you a call to action. So I'm arguing that a process is not very good for its intended use, and it's on me to give you a better process. What I'll do is I'll offer to you to download and implement a tickler file in your own self-management and work management system. The notion of a tickler file is to help you record your decision to postpone work. That does two things for you. One is it puts it in a scheduled place. You'll see it again. And the second thing, as a result of the first, is it gets that task off your mind out into the world where you can deal with it better. I've got instructions on how to implement a tickler file, and you can find them on my website. The URL is dobusywrite.com, all smashed together. dobusywrite.com/tickler-file. If you go there and download it, you'll see 100-year-old technology that was invented about the same time as manila folders and file cabinets that allows people to fairly easily track intent to do tasks. It helps you track a postponement decision because you can't do everything right now. And so this is a way to decide what you're going to do later and to keep track of that decision. So go to the website and download it. Again, the URL is dobusywrite.com/tickler-file. And if you'll give me your email address, I'll send you a link to a video where I implement this on a computer, a Windows computer. So you can have the electronic version of that if you want. If you'd rather have a physical version, then it's pretty easy to figure out how to create one based on what I tell you in the video. So that's my gift to you. Love to have you implement that and see how it goes, and let me know. So when I think about the challenges of managing ourselves using goals as the primary tool, to me, the psychology behind it is somewhat weak. Not the science, but the psychology is somewhat weak and a little bit contradictory. And I'll illustrate what I mean by that. So I said earlier that a lot of the application of this science is around human motivation. And if we set goals, then we're somehow more motivated to achieve results. Now, motivation was a hard thing to study in behaviorist science because they couldn't find an antecedent for motivation. They couldn't say, for example, oh, well, here's the output motivation of a treatment. So they decided that results would be attributed to motivation. And so that's pretty much the way we look at it now. So the common view of goals is if you set a goal and don't achieve the goal, is because somehow you lacked motivation or were using the wrong methodology. And so in some ways, the whole notion of SMART goals is aimed at our motivation. And a further example of this is that there are people who will say, well, once you've set your goal, visualize the world as it will be once you've achieved it. And visualization is intended to give us the mental energy to then meaningfully pursue the goal, meaningfully do whatever it takes to get to that result. But there's also some contradictory science that talks about how visualization, thorough visualization, activates the parts of your brain that are goal seeking. And in some ways, your brain begins to believe that the goal is already achieved. So let me say that in a different way. So we know that visualization, we believe that visualization is a good thing. And so we apply it to goals. And then we say, okay, well, visualize yourself having achieved this goal. And then some more recent science seems to be saying that, well, if you visualize it, then there's a certain part of your brain that shuts down thinking it's already achieved the goal. And so the science here, in my mind, is a little bit equivocal. So do we visualize or do we not? And this is one of these psychology things around goals that seems to me to be weak and or contradictory. So do we visualize or not once we've set our goals? I haven't seen any science around how many goals are reasonable. There's a lot of discussion about focus, and I, of course, think focus is a great thing. So people will say things like, well, what are the 3 things you have to get done today? Focus on those 3 things. I think humans probably need to get more than 3 things done today. Now, focus, I think, is a great thing. It's tactics about how to do it that I question. But this thinking around how many goals are reasonable sort of brings this idea up. Should you have multiple goals? If so, how should those trade-offs be managed if those goals conflict? So, for example, you have a goal to get in better shape, and you also have a goal to make more money. Well, most people think in order to make more money, you need to work more, harder, or more time. And certainly we know that getting in good physical condition requires time. So we have to do the things, exercise and such like, that make us more healthy. And so if you have those 2 goals, how do they interact? And I'm not aware of any science on this front that talks about it. But that's not considered in the goal creation literature. And so how then do we deal with multiple goals? Because as a human, we all have multiple goals. And so again, I think the psychology is a little bit weak, maybe a little bit contradictory on this front. And the final point I make is that goals become binary. And the more we apply the SMART acronym to our goals, the more binary they become. The goal itself becomes more precise, and then it's more obvious whether we meet the goal or not. Well, in some ways, that's a good thing. So if we know for sure that we didn't meet the goal, then we go back and we look at our process. On the other hand, when we make goals into this binary thing, well, we either achieve the goal or we didn't. And if we think about a subject like weight loss, and we're instructed to set goals for this, then our goal is to lose 30 pounds in 6 months. Well, if we lose 20 pounds in 6 months, how do we react to the motivational aspect of the goal? Because we clearly didn't meet it. It's obvious that we didn't meet our goal. The numbers don't lie. But then how do we psychologically look at that? Do we say, well, I failed, Or do we say, well, that wasn't really my goal to begin with. My goal was just to get in better shape, so I succeeded. And depending on your outcome there, depending on how the psychology works in your case, it may be, if you make some progress towards your goal, then what's the point of making the goal very specific, right? And that brings up another challenge of the goal setting paradigm as a way to manage yourself. But I'll get into that. So these are some of the challenges of managing ourselves via this goal-oriented paradigm. And there are others. So there's this whole business. So in one sense, we think that goals are some sort of a panacea. A lot of people think in these terms that, well, if you're not achieving, it's because you haven't set goals. If you claim to have set goals and still aren't achieving, then we're going to talk about whether or not your goals were good goals, and we're going to apply an acronym like SMART, and we're going to say, oh, well, you didn't achieve despite the fact you set goals. You didn't achieve because your goals weren't smart, or weren't smart enough, or weren't smarter. And I think, again, that this is a somewhat misdirected paradigm for self-management and or self-improvement. So one of the challenges of goal setting, we talked about kind of the psychological challenges, but one of the challenges of goal setting is this whole notion of making a goal specific. And invariably that involves some estimation on our part. And we know that humans are terrible estimators. And so when you say, hey, I'm going to lose 30 pounds in 6 months, well, is that something that makes sense? Where did you come by that estimate of your ability to lose 30 pounds in 6 months? And if you misestimate, then how does that interact with the fairly binary nature of the goal? So this whole business about needing to estimate and relying on something that humans have been demonstrated to be bad at, then that kind of brings into question, it's very challenging to set. So I'll say the notion of a specific goal sort of contradicts the notion of a reasonable goal, which reasonable is a word often used for the R in SMART goals. So it's specific, but is it reasonable? Well, reasonable is an estimate. And so how do we interact with that? People say, how much weight do you want to lose? And I go, I don't know. Let me pick a number. Okay, 30 pounds in 6 months. Okay, great. Well, then if I don't achieve 30 pounds in 6 months, then have I failed? So these things interact in those ways. But that's not usually the way a goal is proposed. They don't use the word estimate. There's not a lot of use of the term experimentation either, but I'm getting off on a tangent now. So the notion is that you have to come up with a precise estimate, and then you make your goal specific. So that then interacts with the whole motivation. So there's lots of kind of challenges in goal setting. It requires lots of mental energy. It requires a fair amount of attention and time. Tracking goals. And again, I don't know that these things are bad in and of themselves. It's the mindset that I'm trying to deal with here. Tracking against your goals and pulling your goals out and seeing how you work against them. In an example here, I'm familiar with some writing on the gap and the gain. And this is one of the coaching guys. And he talks about how if you start at point A and you want to be at point B, and in the middle, you're somewhere around point C, right, in between. And from a motivational perspective, the claim is that you're much better off focusing on the difference between A and C than you are focusing on the difference between C and B. In other words, you're much better off thinking about how far you've come from a motivational perspective than you are thinking about how far you still have to go. And I think the focus in the goal paradigm is on how much we have left to go. So the phraseology in this book is the gap is what you still have to do, and the gain is what you've already accomplished. And the notion is for higher levels of motivation, you focus on the gain rather than the gap. And so the point being that all of this is challenging to do. It's challenging to set good goals. It's challenging to track our goals. It's challenging to deal with the result of our goals. And I'm just wondering whether the effort produces the results in our lives. And that's why I wanted to kind of think about this whole goal setting paradigm. In my own experience, there was a time in my life when in about a year, I lost about 45 pounds. And the mechanism I used was to stop eating white food. I didn't use goal setting. I had an intent to lose weight, and my plan was to experiment with a particular process in my own life. And so I didn't set a goal for weight loss. I didn't know how. I didn't know how much weight I needed to lose. It kind of depends on how I look. And I was able to, by changing my process without setting a goal, I was able to begin to lose weight. Now, on the other side of that experience, I now have information. I now have an idea of the way my body works. And I can now go back and do some of the smart things accurately. I can estimate more accurately because I have experience. And at one point, I recall that I was losing about 5 pounds a month, which is a pretty good clip. But the point is, I was able to do this without setting a goal per se. I said, okay, well, what needs to be true in my world? Well, here's some information that tells me that these white foods, by white foods, I'll just make it clear, I'm talking about bread, rice, pasta, potatoes. And so I virtually eliminated them from my diet. So now, after I've achieved the goal, I can now go back and effectively do the things that the SMART acronym would ask me to do. But of course, now I no longer need to do them because I'm not estimating anymore. I have a good idea of how this thing works in my world. So just to make the point of we're bad estimators until we've done something. And then once we've done something, we're no longer estimating. And so this notion of what goal do I set is very, very challenging without already having had some experience. And so wondering about, well, what's the right goal to set and this sort of thing, I think is a challenge to the entire process. And I talked about that a little bit before, but that example is just there. And I had an intent in my life. My intent was to drop some girth, to wear a smaller size of jeans. And I didn't set a goal, but I did have an intent. And so from that, I took away this notion of, intent is maybe sufficient. It may be, hey, I'd like to do this thing. And then there's some sort of a plan involved, some sort of experiment. Now, people go, well, isn't that just making your goal a SMART goal? And I've been accused more than once of splitting hairs, and fair enough. But I think as we look into these different processes of ways to manage ourselves and ways to manage our own performance and in some ways to improve, we have to think about these processes and perhaps in nuanced ways. So, in my own vocabulary and with clients, I tend to talk about intent as compared to heavyweight goal setting, SMART goals, all this sort of thing, which again is somewhat controversial. So when we think about intent, that's where we all have a picture of what we want the world to be. And I chose the word intent fairly carefully because it's softer than a goal. It's more flexible than a goal. And I think that's exactly what's required. And oh, by the way, I'm not saying, hey, never have a goal again, because I don't think that's possible for humans. I think all of us as humans, one of the things we're driven to do is to look at our world and go, it'd be nice if this was different, whatever this is, the color on your bedroom wall, your own trouser size, and we look at these things and we go, it'd be nice. And I think that's a great thing. I think that's where human achievement comes from, is our intent to change ourselves and our environment into what it ought to be. And if you're a listener of the podcast, then you know that that's my definition of work. So how do we manage work? Well, we have intent in the world, and we define what action we can take to move us in the direction of that intent, and then we do it. So I'll give an example of what this looked like in my life from previous experience. So I have from time to time explored the roles in my life, and I don't want to get off on that in a tangent. That's just how this happened. So I have a role of father, and I was looking into that role, and my notion was, and still is, that we can look out 12 to 18 months and we can say, okay, is there anything that this role, any way this role should change over the next 12 to 18 months? Are there tasks that I need to perform? And in order for this role to be in 12 months or 18 months, what I think it should be. A lot of people, again, go back and go, well, you're just setting goals. You're just using different terminology. And again, guilty as charged. I don't think human beings can get through life without setting goals. But my question is about the methodology of doing it. So I had an intent, and my intent is to be a good dad to my kids, which, if we distill that a little bit, I think one of my primary jobs in my role as father is to prepare my kids to be adults. Nothing dramatic there. One of the things that I noticed at this particular time when I was reviewing my role was, hey, in the next 12 to 18 months, my kids are going to turn 16. My kids are 6 months apart. And well, yeah, so they're going to turn 16, which means what? Well, they're going to be interested in a driver's license. Okay, great. What are my tasks around it? So my task around that is to help them pass the driver's license exam and the driving test. What are my tasks around that intent? My tasks around that intent are to be in the car with them, to instruct them. Okay, what do I need to do? Well, my task is, and see how I'm using the word task and finer grained task rather than wrapping this in some sort of goal language. Okay, I need to be in the car with them. All right. So I took on some tasks and scheduled some work items to be in the car with them and to say, okay, well, I'm going to drive and I'm going to show you some things about the car. So one of the things I showed them, and this was not easy to pull off, but one of the things I showed them was what it feels like when your anti-lock brakes engage. And so I'm training them I'm sharing knowledge with them, right? So the result was I felt comfortable that they would be pretty good drivers by the time they needed to drive on there. Very nice. So I fulfilled what I thought was an important aspect of my role for them. So if we think about that in terms of what would have been a good goal, well, if we think about a goal, well, I want them to avoid accidents. Okay, great. Can I train them such that they'll never have an accident? Well, probably not, but I don't know. So, what is my goal here? What's my estimate? Well, I don't know. Am I going to fail my goal if they ever have an accident? Well, that didn't seem to meet the reasonable criteria. As it turns out, and I didn't find this out until later, as it turns out, there's a statistic that says 50% of new drivers will have an accident in their first 2 years of driving. Well, doing the math, that means that I only had a 25% chance of getting through 2 years with my two kids and neither one of them having an accident in the first 2 years. So again, back to if I had set a goal of no accidents, is that reasonable? Well, not really, right? I'm looking for a 1 in 4 shot. On the other hand, if I do set that goal and they do have an accident, what happens to my thoughts of myself around achieving that goal? Well, I wrote it down. They clearly didn't, we clearly didn't achieve it. I can make some excuses and whatever I want to do, but just the challenge around goal setting versus having the intent. So I tend to use the terminology of intent. So I go from intent to task. And the task is the next thing I can do to make progress in this direction. I certainly believe in some degree of planning. I think humans overplan. And again, this is back to the estimation and predicting the future thing that we're so bad at. And I want to plan in the short term. I want to say, what's the next thing I need to do in order to make progress on my intent? And so, again, my concern here is with addressing goal setting as some panacea, as some one way that we need to govern our own lives, to manage ourselves, so to speak. And I think that the science is a little bit, well, not as strong as maybe we'd like. So then I go over to intent. So I'm well aware that many organizations use management by objectives. One of my managerial heroes is Peter Drucker, and he actually coined the term management by objectives. And the way that's implemented in the business world is through goal setting. And we sit down with the people who report to us and we say, okay, here are some areas in which you could improve as a member of the team. You know, what would you like to address? How would you like to do this? And this is this idea of participative management. And then we get into this goal setting process. And I think this is what most enlightened managers would do. And I just wonder if that's the right approach, if that's the best approach. And I would argue that while we need to have expectations, right, which I think is the real power of management by objectives as presented by Peter Drucker. I think when he says objectives, what he actually, one way to interpret that, well, one way to interpret it is certainly, set goals and make sure they're smart goals. And if smart goals don't work, then use smarter goals. And if smarter goals don't work, then fire your employee. And I'm painting this in very black and white, and I understand that that's just to make the point. I hope you understand that's just to make the point. But management by objectives, I think in Drucker's terminology, is more, let's clarify what the expectation is. Let's clarify your role here in the organization. Let's clarify what role you fulfill as a member of a team. And if we think about management by objectives, then that helps us clarify what it is we're talking about. And then we may take the additional step of adding, you know, formal goal setting to that. I would argue that the evidence of formal goal setting in the terms we've talked about here is not terribly strong, retrospectively speaking. And there are lots of reasons this could be, but I just question the process here. So I'm arguing that a process is not very good for its intended use, and it's on me to give you a better process. What I'll do is I'll offer to you to download and implement a tickler file in your own self-management and work management system. The notion of a tickler file is to help you record your decision to postpone work. That does two things for you. One is it puts it in a scheduled place. You'll see it again. And the second thing, as a result of the first, is it gets that task off your mind out into the world where you can deal with it better. I've got instructions on how to implement a tickler file, and you can find them on my website. The URL is dobusywrite.com, all smashed together. dobusywrite.com/tickler-file. If you go there and download it, you'll see 100-year-old technology that was invented about the same time as manila folders and file cabinets that allows people to fairly easily track intent to do tasks. It helps you track a postponement decision because you can't do everything right now. And so this is a way to decide what you're going to do later and to keep track of that decision. So go to the website and download it. Again, the URL is dobusywrite.com/tickler-file. And if you give me your email address, I'll send you a link to a video where I implement this on a computer, a Windows computer. So you can have the electronic version of that if you want. If you'd rather have a physical version, then it's pretty easy to figure out how to create one based on what I tell you in the video. So that's my gift to you. Love to have you implement that and see how it goes, and let me know. What do we conclude? What's our takeaway here? Well, our takeaway is about how to think about goals. Okay. And we'll think through that. But first, I want to summarize. This has kind of been a long discussion, not long so much as just pretty involved in lots of different things. So I'm going to recap, and then we'll draw some conclusion about how then should we proceed. What should we do? So in summary, there is some scientific evidence about this formal goal setting process. It's not that the science is weak, it's that the effect size is small. Okay, so the amount of change you can expect by adopting this is actually fairly small. The thing about goals is it seems like a good idea. It seems like something that should be useful to us, where in point of fact, there's not great evidence of its ability to be a good system for us to manage ourselves. Okay. And there are challenges to do it, as I've laid out. There's the estimation challenge. There's the fact that it's overhead. There's how does it influence our motivation, which we don't know. A primary challenge is, do goals interfere with each other? And if they do, is that interference increased by the specificity, the formalism of the goal setting process? And the challenge is that the goal language is very easy to say. It's very easy to pop in and go, hey, set some goals. And then, hey, let's tune up the goals. Okay, well, now you go achieve the goals. And I think too many people give it too much weight as a self-management and even as an organizational management technique for those reasons. There is some anecdotal evidence, and I didn't deal with this previously in the science part, but there is some anecdotal evidence that people who set goals seem to be more successful. And I think that's fine. And if that's evidence that moves you towards the overhead of goal setting and managing your life through formal goal application, then great. But I will say that anecdotal evidence almost always introduces something called survivor bias. So we look at successful people and we say, okay, how did they get successful? Well, obviously they claim to have set goals. And so we go, ooh, well, let me set goals. Well, survivor bias, survivorship bias is that we study effective people and say, okay, well, what did they do? And we don't necessarily compare them to ineffective people. In this case, effective, ineffective, right? Hard words to use when we're talking about people. But if we just look at people who have been successful and say, okay, well, they set goals, well, managing the goal process is an act of high levels of discipline and high levels of thought about what you're going to do. So what we don't know is any old process good enough to produce some results? Or is there something specific about goal setting that makes it different from other kinds of processes? So that's the notion of survivor bias that may influence some of the anecdotal evidence that you're aware of. And there are other kind of issues there that are a little bit too detailed to get into. But I was trying to summarize. So in summary, goals, it's pretty quick and easy to say. Okay. Oh, set goals. Here's what those goals look like. Go do it. Anecdotal evidence is not strong evidence often. It is evidence, but it is not strong evidence often. I understand, and I've said several times, as a human, you can hardly not set goals. It's very, I would say, impossible, but highly challenging as a human to sit in the world and not go, wow, that should be different. Okay. And I think that's a great attribute that we have is we're driven to improve ourselves and our environment. And I think that's very important. So it's okay. You can't not set goals. You can't look at the world and go, everything's okay. I mean, you can have some contentment, but I think that, this notion, if we say, oh, well, a goal is just to make something different in the world, to improve something in the world, then I agree with goals. And it's all this mechanism and all this overhead that I think produces the challenge. And again, goals as some panacea really concerns me. And is this the only way that we can go about managing ourselves? And I think that's a question that needs asking. And if that makes me a contrarian, then in this particular case, so be it. You may have noticed that I'm something of a contrarian in a lot of places. It gets me in trouble. And my bottom line, I think, is if goals don't work for you, then I don't think that's some failing in your self-management or in your self-improvement. I think that you can use intent to derive tasks and in that way run your life based on your attention and using it in good ways, using processes that help you and not just automatically feeling like, well, this goal setting thing is a panacea. And if I can't do it, then there's something wrong with me. Okay, I don't think the science is nearly strong enough to say, well, I set goals and can't achieve them, so I'm a bad person. I don't want you thinking that. And I think it's very challenging to do well. And there may be challenges to it as a principle of self-management. So that's the summary. So what's our takeaway? Again, the takeaway is if that language doesn't work for you, I think that's okay. I think that there are other ways, in my own mind, better ways to set up your self-management, to set up your self-improvement. I think it's serviceable to have an intent. I think it's serviceable to look at the world through the lens of that intent and to say, my intention is that I'll at some point in the future have a smaller pant size. What do I do about that? And then to select a task, even if it's an experiment, and do that and see how it works. But maintain that intent versus worrying about whether you achieved the goal or didn't achieve a goal. So that, I think, is the takeaway here. Of course, if you have a different perspective, I'd love to hear from you. You can feel free to shoot me an email, larry@dobusyright.com, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. And just want to work through some of this material with you and help you think about it maybe in a different way. So my advice is to manage yourself based on your attention and to be very careful about wasting your attention in ways that don't serve you. And if we can manage our attention, then that's probably the strongest way to move through, particularly in the modern environment. So again, I would recommend Attention Compass. I've had great success coaching people on managing themselves and their lives, particularly from the perspective of lowering stress and anecdotal evidence, right? But the experiences that I've had with coaching clients have been around, just identify the next thing that you need to do to move in the direction of your intent, and then go and do that. And use data to tell you what kind of progress you're making, and to put some effort into that on a routine basis, and to think about, what do I want the world to be? What's my intent? And then immediately move to, what can I do? Maybe less, how do I think about this? And how do I create good goals? And a little bit more of, what's the next step? Track that task such that you know that you're going to do it, and then see what your result is, and then rinse and repeat. And in this way, life is very experimental. It's somewhat playful. And that way we can manage ourselves with a minimum of stress and anxiety. And that's what I want for people through the Attention Compass process. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.